I think people are maybe a little quick to discount the power that you have as an individual in these collective action movements, and just like being a body that's part of this protest really makes an impression on the people who are making the decisions. People we've elected can't ignore you when you are physically in their office, sitting in their office, or physically outside the building, and you're part of a mass group of people.
Welcome to the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast, a higher education in personal finance. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Roberts. This is Season 5, Episode 13, and today my guest is Jewel Tomasula, a graduate student at Georgetown University in biology, specifically ecology and evolutionary biology. Jewel participates in climate change collective action through the Sunrise Movement, through 500 Women Scientists, and at her university. We discuss how people can combat climate change as individuals and collectively through the lens of personal finance, covering frugal and environmental strategies, socially responsible investing, and leveraging our affiliations with universities. Listen on for actionable strategies that do not require you to be a homeowner or in command of significant capital. Without further ado, here's my interview with Jewel Tomasula. I am so happy that Jewel Tomasula is joining me on the podcast today. This is a really special one for me because Jewel was the person who worked with me on editing the podcast and creating the show notes in the first 3 seasons. So really happy to have her back on now as a guest, even though she's moved on from the editor role. And today we are actually talking about kind of one of Jewel's areas of special interest, which is climate change and climate change collective action. And we will get into how this intersects with personal finance momentarily. But before we do, Jewel, would you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Hi. Thanks, Emily. So I am a PhD student at Georgetown University. I'm working on a biology PhD, and more specifically, my discipline is ecology and evolutionary biology. The ecosystem that I focus on is the salt marshes, and they're an ecosystem that is really affected by human activities, as well as really important for us adapting to climate change and dealing with sea level rise, and salt marshes are important for carbon storage. So I look at the resilience of this ecosystem, and so I have a very ecology perspective, but I also think about climate change a lot because of the setting of my research.
Yeah, that's perfect. So very strong professional connection as well. What is it that you're doing outside of your professional capacity in terms of climate change collective action?
So I would call myself an active participant in the Sunrise Movement, and also kind of a mobilizer of the 500 Women Scientists network. So I wouldn't say that I'm a big leader in any sorts, but I'm someone who closely follows along and participates when I can. So with the Sunrise Movement, I participated in a December 2018 action that was we visited our members of Congress and talked to them about supporting a Green New Deal resolution, which hadn't been formally introduced yet, but it was an initial talking about kind of increasing or ramping up climate action and taking on more stringent goals than just the Paris Agreement, and saying we want a stronger plan for climate action. And then it was a sit-in of Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer and McGovern representatives, the top Democrat offices. And that was a really powerful experience, just to be one of hundreds of people that join together and taking this action, and really showing our representatives that people care about this, and they can't avoid it when we're all sitting in the hallway or sitting outside their offices. And so I've tried to keep up with Sunrise Movement and participate when I can, not that often because I'm doing my PhD work as well. And but then with 500 Women Scientists, with other leaders in that organization, we wrote an op-ed for Scientific American called Scientists Must Speak Up for the Green New Deal, and we kind of outlined why scientists should be interested in this resolution and should take it seriously and advocate for it. And then also I think that's the group that when I go to kind of just participating in strikes or protests, that I usually kind of group up the DC pod of 500 women scientists to go together to these actions and support the leaders. And I try to amplify in my offline as and online networks what the leaders of the youth climate strikes are kind of like their message, and Sunrise Movement message as well.
Yeah, I don't know. I think you have this interesting crossover like identity, right? That you are identity wise compatible with these various different groups. And it's nice that you can sort of be an intersection point between them and be, as you were just saying, amplifying messages from one to the other and back and forth. So that's great. Thank you for detailing that. So I think that now we'll get to the point where I want to say a couple words about why we're even talking about climate change on a personal finance podcast, because maybe, you say, well, Emily, this isn't a good fit. Like, why this is about money? Like, why are you talking about this? Or like, Emily, this is too political. Like, why are you covering this topic? You don't usually cover politics. And that's not at all my intention. But the reason that I think about climate change in the way that it intersects with my business is because within personal finance, and what I do a lot is thinking about like the long term, right? In my own life, in the lives of my clients. When I talk about like investing and the power of compound interest, I'm throwing out 50 years as a timeline that we should be looking over to think about our money. And over 50 years, over many decades, as you said, we're already seeing effects of climate change, and certainly over, to 2030 and beyond that point. This is something that I think should be factored into our financial plans, as well as whatever motivation you might have to care about this as like a human being. Specifically, it intersects our finances in this long-term planning aspect and also like short-term planning. And there is this wonderful sort of synergy between frugality and conservation or environmentalism and minimalism. And so a lot of the strategies that you might use to reduce your carbon footprint or be more environmentally focused in general are also ones that dovetail really, really well with being frugal in general, or being a minimalist in general, and not consuming so much. And so I just think there's if you're focusing, whether you're focusing first on, reducing your carbon footprint or focusing first on frugality, you're going to end up probably doing a lot of things that will benefit both facets, right? Just naturally by the choices that you make, because as we'll go through in a few minutes, there are a lot of things you can do that are good for your wallet and good for the planet. So that's kind of why I wanted to bring this up, is that there's just this wonderful overlap. So not only should you be thinking about your own finances and what's best for you in the long term, maybe you can also direct your finances and your life choices in a way that's compatible with being more sustainable long term as well. So Jewel, can you just start, just make a couple comments here, like what can people do as individuals to reduce their carbon footprint?
Yeah, thanks. I think you outlined that you outlined that so well about how we have to think about our personal finances in the long term, and really that's good for us. That's like a healthy thing. But if we're going to be doing that, we also need to be thinking about the state of our environment and our how sustainable our economy is as a whole, and how that might be changing over. Well, I mean, I would hope that our economy is going to look really different, but like in 50 years, that's what my big hope is. And so, this question of individual, like kind of the individual carbon footprint and your responsibility there, really centers on the power you have as a consumer. That's often what you see in articles. If you can just Google like how to go green, and you can find lots of options and like just lots of suggestions, but I feel like they hardly ever like take into account that like what power you actually have as a consumer in your dollar. Like if you're someone with like a really constrained income, and like you only have like a few $100s of spent like discretionary spending every month, if even that, like it looks really different than somebody who has a lot of discretionary income and like the power you have there.
So can I just jump in to ask? So like something I see, for example, in these how to go green suggestions is like make your home more energy efficient. And so I'm thinking, okay, well, I'm a renter. Yeah, I have absolutely no influence over this. When I become a homeowner, I would love to think about that, but it's not something for me in the here and now. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about, that people just have differing degrees of influence over their own lives in terms of especially how much discretionary income they really have?
Yeah, exactly, right? Like I have to find somewhere to live, and I like in so I live in the state of Virginia, and there's essentially a monopoly with Dominion Energy, and you don't have very much choice over like where your power comes from. Like, and you see a lot of these lists. It's like install solar panels or make your home energy efficient. I'm like, I live in an apartment, but yeah, so like but it is really empowering to think about, like, even if you have a constrained income, like where you do have power in your budget and your spending, and trying to direct that as much as you can towards the way we want the world to look, like a more ethical and world with like healthier and safer communities. So I think part of that is like, okay, so you can't if you are living in an apartment, there's only so much you can do, but maybe you can live closer to work and you can take out that transportation part of the carbon footprint because you're walking or you're taking public transit. With individual, like the big things I think for anyone are like your diet and transportation. So if there's ways that you can alter those to have like a smaller impact, a smaller footprint, then like those are two big things. And so meal planning is one that like I've been engaging with more recently, especially since starting grad school. And my partner and I have found that that's also like part of frugality, and really like making a difference in our like like personal finance, like wellness. That meal planning makes a difference, and also like really reduces our food waste. We that made a big difference in how much we're wasting, not just in food, but also like in the plastic that comes with food. And so if you're not having takeout all the time, or just like getting pre-prepared meals, there's like a lot of packaging waste that's reduced there. I guess something that I care about with like having that zero waste, as well, is that I have really like minimized how much I use. So that's like kind of in that minimalism that you talked about. And so I'm not like kind of that buy nothing new, or going to like thrift shops, or just holding on to things and repairing them if they break. Like there's still clothing alteration shops and shoe repair shops out there. And so that's something that I utilize. And so while those things aren't always like the most frugal necessarily, like sometimes it is cheaper to just buy a new pair of shoes, but like I have a pair of shoes that I can like get them fixed, then that's more in the mindset, like just because it is like just as cheap to get a new pair, like there's still a good pair of shoes. Like, so those kind of things I've really built into my budget, and I think a lot of like PhDs could think in that terms as well, and just kind of rejecting our like disposable like consumerism system that we have. And yeah, so those are some of like the individual actions I think people could look towards.
Let me jump in there because I have a couple comments about what you just said, which I thought was great. So in terms of like the food that you eat, you're talking about reducing waste, which is awesome. I think I read years and years ago, I think there's a book called American Wasteland, which is about food waste. And I think it said that 50% of food is wasted, like that we grow in America, doesn't get into people's like stomachs.
Mm-hmm.
Most of that does not happen in your refrigerator. It happens
No,
prior
yeah.
to that point. So again, not something you necessarily have influence on, although I guess we can choose where we source our food from.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe getting it more from like local farmers or something rather than, conventionally grown agriculture. And also, I don't know, I guess I've been seeing these advertisements for like ugly produce and like similar sorts of services like that, where it's like food that wouldn't make it to the grocery store. You can still buy that and eat it because it's perfectly good. It just doesn't look pretty enough to be in the grocery store. So there's different like sourcing things you can do around that as well. And you were just saying about packaging, like that also reduces packaging,
Mm-hmm.
transportation, all that kind of stuff. You didn't mention what you eat, but I know that
Yeah.
one of the major things that you can do is reduce your consumption of meat and dairy,
Mm-hmm.
particularly beef. I think beef is one of those
Yeah.
big offenders in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So anyway, food selection can also go into that. And it's really difficult to change your diet. I mean, I know that there's
Yeah.
all kinds of things that influence why you eat what you eat, but to the degree that you're able to like think about addressing that in terms of less
Yeah,
beef, lamb consumption and dairy.
it's like a really personal thing to talk. That's something that I've experienced. Is I would say I've spent like the last 10 years of my life trying to be vegetarian, when it's just like it's like a really personal and like often a cultural thing too. Like food is how you connect with your family often, and so I get really excited with plant-based diets. I think, well, I have like a special spot in my heart for plants. And so I think it's so cool, like just what we can do with plants. So I have like a personal excitement about plant-based diets. But then from the frugal side, like meat is often more expensive, especially beef. Then when we do have beef every now and then, it's always what's on sale. So like if we're getting it on sale, it's not really part of the demand, like driving demand for beef in a way.
I
So
see what you're
that's
saying. Yeah.
right. So that's kind of thinking about like what's the power of your dollar here, and having beef is it's kind of part of the like one. I have like looked into how what they say the average American consumption of beef is, and that's like it's a little absurd. Like we do not, it's not healthy for us as a culture to be eating that much beef, like for our own bodies as well as for our environment. So there's like a lot of like that's very justified, and that's one of the first things you'll see. But if you're like someone really constrained in your income, then you're probably not eating very much meat anyway. And I know there is kind of calls for meatless Mondays and stuff, but like when we do meal planning, and this is me and my partner, and my partner is environmentally minded, but he still has the kind of attachment to meat, and that like that cultural element that like we're kind of working through. So I'll just like be honest there. I'm like one that pushes more for plant-based foods, and he's still like, oh, but the meat, it like tastes good, and it's part of how I know how to cook. Like just that's the expectation that your plate has like a meat and then a veggie and like a potato. Like that's like a very like ingrained, I guess, American um, conception. And but if we've like been looking at our weekly like meal plans, and it's only like meat for one meal a day typically, and often the meat is like a small part of the meal. Like that is like something that has changed as we've started being more intentional with our meal planning. And so like if you just think meatless Mondays, okay, one, like that's 3 meals out of your week that don't have meat. See if you can, I would say for everyone, like if you can have 2 meals a day without meat, that's like kind of a big win right there. And you're probably a lot less than the average American. Unfortunately, we definitely do need to change this expectation that every meal should have meat in it.
Yeah, and I don't actually think that's a historically accurate view of the American diet. But
Mm-hmm.
anyway, you're right. That is sort of in the cultural zeitgeist. But I guess the sort of a larger point that I wanted to make about what you were just saying is that, like, as you were just saying earlier, as a consumer, and especially if we're talking to, graduate students and postdocs and people who have a smaller degree of control over their finances and their lives, make the changes that you can and that you're
Mm-hmm.
willing to, and don't, like, do what you can, right? Like it's okay if for the time being,
Mm-hmm.
you cannot change your diet because of whatever else is going on in your life, or you cannot change where you live to start, taking public transit. Like maybe you can choose one of these areas to make a big shift in and worry about the other
Mm-hmm.
ones later. It's good, like, to make even a small change. Like you were just saying with meatless Mondays, or, having 2 meals a day that are meatless or whatever. Like it's not that you have to become completely vegan or completely
Mm-hmm.
vegetarian to make an adjustment from where you are today. It's just about making some degree of progress in that area. Were there any other individual actions that you wanted to discuss?
Yeah, I have one more that I've been exploring recently, but I do want to mention 2 articles that I've found kind of really like light bulb like awakening for like the nuance of this issue. And one of them is titled "What We Should Really Do for Climate" by Samuel Miller McDonald, and that's published in The Trouble. And then the other is "I Work in the Environmental Movement. I Don't Care If You Recycle" by Mary Anais Hegler.
I think I
And
actually read that one.
yeah, and honestly, anything by Mary Hegler is like is on point. So, and that one's in Vox, and so those are 2 I think that are really like helping to like increase awareness and making you understand like how constrained this can be, and like how to like feel that like individual responsibility, but also to like channel it and grapple it with it better, and understand how income plays in, and how we kind of just need to force the whole system to change. So that like how trapped you can feel, but also like what personal empowerment you can find in it. So along those lines, something I've been looking at just like this summer that I kind of just slipped by me before was like where my money is actually kept, like in my bank, what, like who I'm letting have my money while I'm waiting to use it. And also looking into investing and trying not to be a typical like 20 something like grad student who just like puts off investing. So I have been using Wells Fargo. And so that is kind of just because that's the bank that my parents set up for me, and I never really thought about it. And even when I was learning about how Wells Fargo is funding oil pipelines and doing other shady stuff, I didn't think about it, or like didn't think about taking my money out of there. And so that's something I've like just done, and I'm transitioning to using a bank called Aspiration. And so they are an online bank that tries to make themselves an accessible option that's not using any of the money for fossil fuels or gun manufacturing either. So those are two of their big things, and just kind of building that social awareness into their whole model. So just, I mean, like to have a bank that's like thinking about this ethically. And they also have sustainable investing options. And so I have $2,000 in there now, but I put in $1,500. And so over 2 years, I think it's a little over $1,500 that I put in. So it's like grown a little bit over like a few $100s over 2 years. And you actually get to set your own fee for that. They have what's called the pay what's fair fee. So I had it set pretty low. And so over 2 years, I've only paid like just under $10 in the fees. And you could set it to zero, actually, if that's something you really need to do to just start trying investing.
That's interesting. I hadn't heard about that model before. And even Wells Fargo's actions that you just mentioned, I mean, I know that they're sort of, blacklisted because of their like consumer protection like fails. But I didn't even know that, I didn't think before about like the way that they're using just the cash you have with them at any point. I'll have to take a look at my bank and see how they're ranking on this metric. Emily here for a brief interlude. Tax season is upon us. And while no one loves this time of year, it's particularly difficult for postbac fellows, funded grad students, and postdoc fellows. Even professional tax preparers are often thrown for a loop by our unique tax situation. And don't get me started on tax software. I provide tons of support at this time of year for PhD trainees preparing their tax returns, from free articles and videos, to paid at-your-own-pace workshops, to live seminars and webinars for universities and research institutes. The best place to go to check out all of this material is pfforphds.com/tax. That's pfforphds.com/TAX. Don't struggle through tax season on your own. Visit my website for the exact information you need in the most efficient form available. Now back to the interview. So, okay, great. So you thought about where your cash is. And I know we also wanted to talk a bit about investing, right? About what's called socially responsible investing, or SRI. So this is something that you're learning about, that I'm learning about right now. So can you start making a couple comments about that?
My understanding, there's a spectrum of like, maybe it's with a typical investing group like Fidelity or Vanguard, and they just have options that are more socially minded, and you can pick those options as well, but that it's still focused on like growing your money. And then
we should say more generally that like socially responsible investing is not just about like these environmental causes. It could be about like social justice, or like, working conditions, or the sort of like sin areas like tobacco and firearms and those kinds of areas. So depending on your exact social preferences, you can make different choices within these groups, but but continue. I just wanted to say that like SRIs are sort of at a higher categorically, they cover more categories than we're talking about today, but go on.
Like kind of this overall like kind of ethical minded, like, is what I'm investing in doing harm to other people that I'm not necessarily seeing every day, but like out in the world, is there harm or sketchy things being done out in the world with where I'm investing my money? And like kind of that empowerment is like no, like I want my money to be supporting the things that do good in the world and not the things that are doing harm. And yeah, that's bigger than just like, or more encompassing than just environment or carbon emissions. It's about how like the people are treated or as well. Like, so then there's like some like more typical, I guess, I don't know if that's like more typical options like through Fidelity or Vanguard. There's these big investing um, options, but then there's kind of the filter out option, since that's what I have, where they like it's still performing like pretty well and it's not super pure. So like and through aspiration they have these pretty accessible investing options. Like the deposit you have to make is pretty low. Like they have where you can set your own fee. So I think for like someone starting out and investing, like it's something accessible. And it's also passive. Like you're not having to pick out each stock that you want to invest in. Like it's a diversified portfolio already, but they do have I think I was looking at it, Amazon and Facebook are part of their portfolio. So like some people might think that those companies are a little sketchy, but what they do have filtered out are anything with fossil fuels and gun manufacturing and some of these other like kind of big like sin stocks, as you had mentioned before. And then with socially responsible investing, there is the option to like pick out the specific stocks, but then it's not passive anymore. And that's something that I don't have any experience with, and is I think a little like out of my realm at this stage in my life that I would look into.
Yeah, longtime listeners definitely know that I teach the strategy of passive investing versus active investing. And so when we're talking about getting into the socially responsible realm, it is a bit more active, right? Because you've decided you, the consumer, and also the person running the fund or whatever, have to look into, okay, it's not just a strict definition on what are the biggest companies in the US. It's more like, okay, we have some criteria that we're evaluating these companies on, and some are not going to make the cut, right? So it's a little bit more active in that sense, but it can still be a fairly passive approach if you go with like a managed fund, because their criteria can be rather fixed. And again, they're not like trying to market time, and they're not like picking and choosing necessarily individual companies that are in or out based on whims. It's all based on sort of an investing plan that's been laid out in advance. So it can still be a fairly passive strategy in terms of the important aspects of passive investing, like being well diversified and not trying to market time and so forth. So it's a little bit more active than like classic passive investing strategies, but still fairly passive overall, or at least it can be. And really, I think that it's so difficult as an individual to do all the research that is necessary to pick individual stocks when you're trying to evaluate them on these metrics that we're talking about that SRIs care about. So I do think it's a really good idea to go in with a larger fund where there's a set of professionals doing that kind of research for you. And as long as you are selective about which fund you go into and make sure that it matches up with your values, then you should be good to go, and it'll be fairly passive on your end.
Yeah, and I've been trying to think in terms of like, I really appreciate that aspiration just has like a whole values model behind what they're doing, and as opposed to just like being a bank that's all about like the money, like no matter who or where is getting hurt, or just like what's good for business, kind of like I feel like it's part of that just system change. And since like let's have institutions that are actually accountable, and that care about the well-being of communities, instead of institutions that are about like the bottom line with profit.
Yeah. So before we started recording this episode, I sent you another podcast episode that I had listened to from How to Money, which is another great personal finance podcast that I definitely recommend. So episode 97, Socially Responsible Investing, is where they went over this model that I was really learning about for the first time, that there are gradations within socially responsible investing. And I think you've already covered two of them. So it's called ESG, Environmental, Social, and Governance, and then also SRI, Socially Responsible Investing. And those are more about They're pretty similar to like your classic like mutual fund, where it is largely driven by like what's going to be best in terms of like the profit and bottom line for the investor, with differing degrees of sensitivity towards these social issues that you might care about. And then the final category was impact investing, where the goal of impact investing is not necessarily get a great return, although maybe that will happen. But the goal is really to influence the world through the companies that you invest in, right? So like the profit thing is secondary to the mission, right? Do you do any impact investing at this point?
No, yeah, that's where I say it's a little out of my realm. As someone I'm, I'm at the grad student stage where I'm just trying to actually invest instead of not investing. But that I could bring up here is that like if you go into like the real job that offers the 401k, like that's like a great plan and you need to do it. But like I am trying to take this time in my life where I don't have that option, where I don't have employer match, I don't have the 401k option, kind of like opens me up to try other investing options. I'm trying to look at it that way, but still with kind of with actually like that passive where I can just pick a managed fund and like make contributions to it. But yeah, the impact investing is interesting, and I don't know if I would manage to get there in the future. It's like yeah, because you have to really pay attention and do research.
Well, I think there could still be impact investing funds that you go into. It's just that they're going to be composed differently than like the SRI or the ESG types of funds. But I totally agree with you. I think that's an amazing point that like, yeah, when you have an employer and you're being provided a 401k or 403b, like, especially if there's a match involved, like you really do need to use that in terms of your own personal finances. That is the best place for your retirement money to be. But when you have an IRA, either because you don't currently have access to a 401k or you haven't in the past, but any IRA money that you have is completely self-directed. So if you want to invest inside SRIs with your IRA money and do whatever is offered to you through your 401k, that's a really good balance that you can strike as an individual. And as people, as graduate students and postdocs, we start out probably only having access to an IRA. So like the core and the part of your investments that are growing kind of the most over time because you started them the earliest, those are the ones where you can have like the most discretion over where they go. And every time you leave a job, you close out your 401k or 403b, you can roll that money into your IRA and still have that, total discretion over how it's invested. So I really love that you made that point. So we've kind of moved from talking about individual actions and diet and transportation and so forth to, okay, now we're talking about investing, which is something you can do as an individual, but it also, you're really banding together with other individuals when you go into these funds and you choose SRIs over conventional investments. What are some other things that we can do as individuals, but that is joining together with other people for this, collective action around climate change?
Yeah, and with that like collective action, I think that like the understanding there is that there are some decisions made like at the collective level with the idea that they're accountable to you as an individual. Like we have voted, like whether like we have voted people in that should be accountable to us as voters, or there are people working on behalf of a community that should be accountable to the community members. So whether it's like elected officials or a board of trustees at a university or at another institution that you are associated with, there's those people are making the decisions on behalf of everyone else, but they should be accountable to you, and you have power in holding them accountable. So that's like where like you as an individual have like the chance to use your voice and to like pay attention. So maybe starting with, as we were talking about investing, there's also the question with universities and where they have their investments and their endowments. And if you like, if you're a PhD, you have an association within a university, whether you're currently there or you're an alumni, and you have power in influencing like how the university is using their money. Especially I think when you're an alumni, when you like, you can say, I'm not going to donate to you, or you can like contact the university, or be part of movement. I think people are maybe a little quick to discount your like the power that you have as an individual in these collective action movements, and just like being a body that's part of this protest really makes an impression on the people who are making the decisions. Like the people we've elected like can't ignore you when you are physically in their office, like sitting in their office, or physically outside the building, and you're part of like a mass group of people. Paying attention to those and like joining in when you can, and like just even voicing support and talking about it amongst like your coworkers and your family is an important thing. But then when, if you have the right to vote, or you're able to use your vote, in the US, paying attention to what kind of plans the candidates have, and like how firm they are in their belief, and voting for those candidates, and then not stopping at voting, actually realizing that you have power as a constituent to go and meet with them and join with a group to go meet with them. So I mentioned being part of the Sunrise Movement action in December, and that started with us going to our representative's office. And so I went with a group of people who are Northern Virginians to Representative Don Byer's office, and we like talked with the staff there. And then about a month later, we got an email saying that our representative had like changed his attitude towards like the Green New Deal because of what we had come and said to him. So it's like you can almost see more immediate like change and impact just by like stepping up a little and like using your voice and being part of movements. But you could also look like in your communities and see what kind of like actions are happening there, and any time that you can like hold systems accountable, or like change systems and think about like how can your community be more resilient. I think it's part of that power that is a little underutilized by people in their 20s. I think especially like we need to, it's definitely growing, and that's like really exciting to me. But that I think we could use more people. I could always use more people just at least paying attention.
I like what you brought up there, and it goes back to kind of what we said near the beginning of the episode of like you as an individual can be part of groups at different levels, right? Like, so you're a voter and you have representatives at both, the national and also the state and the local levels, and you vote for the people that you want to be in office, but then also once they're in office, you still have influence with them to some degree over how they, the decisions that they're making once in office. They're still supposed to be representing you. And then not only are you like a voter, but you're also a member of like an academic community with your university, maybe multiple different universities. And then you also are a person who lives in your community. And like you're using your identity in terms of like what age you are to be affiliated with one movement. And also like you're a scientist, so you're affiliated with another movement. So we think we could all think about the various like facets of our identity and where we live and so forth, and the different groups that intersects with, and to see, as you were just saying, sort of see what's going on in our own communities at these various levels and start participating as you feel, comfortable, or as you see there's something, to participate in to make your voice heard. So yeah, I really appreciate that. It's not something I've been involved with personally to this point, but I'm definitely now going to be looking for more of those opportunities.
Yeah, I think just like following your representative on social media, or like signing up for their email, is like really enlightening, and just like a way to stay like, what are they actually saying about these issues, or what kind of bills are they introducing? That's like a really simple way that like raises your awareness by a lot, and kind of like shows you the opportunities like to go to a town hall, or to call them up. So that's like one really simple thing.
The larger point around kind of a lot of the discussion we've had today is, you can evaluate where you are now and what you've been doing, and you don't have to keep doing the same thing, right? You don't have to give into inertia of like, well, I've always eaten this way, or like I've always lived in this place, or I've always, kept my money here. Now that you're aware, if you weren't already, that these various different areas impact, how sustainable your lifestyle is, or where you're putting your money and what it's doing in the world. Now that you have a little bit heightened awareness about that, you can reconsider and make changes where you're able to. So Jewel, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. This is a real treat for me.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Emily.
Listeners, thank you for joining me for this episode. pfforphds.com/podcast is the hub for the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast. There, you can find links to all the episode show notes and a form to volunteer to be interviewed. I'd love for you to check it out and get more involved. If you've been enjoying the podcast, here are 4 ways you can help it grow. 1. Subscribe to the podcast and rate and review it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or whatever platform you use. 2. Share an episode you found particularly valuable on social media or with your PhD peers. 3. Recommend me as a speaker to your university or association. My seminars cover the personal finance topics PhDs are most interested in, like investing, debt repayment, and taxes. 4. Subscribe to my mailing list at pfforphds.com/subscribe. Through that list, you'll keep up with all the new content and special opportunities for personal finance for PhDs. See you in the next episode, and remember, you don't have to have a PhD to succeed with personal finance, but it helps. The music is Stages of Awakening by Poddington Bear from the Free Music Archive and is shared under CC by NC. Podcast editing and show notes creation by Lourdes Bobio.